The courtroom was quieter than I expected when Daniel realized what Martin Hale had just read was not a warning but a final amendment already executed 6 months earlier. My son sat frozen, his hand still resting on the leather folder he had brought to challenge me, while Brooke's face drained of color in a way I had only imagined during all those sleepless nights. Martin adjusted his glasses and repeated it for the judge, for the clerk, and for every relative Daniel had dragged there hoping to paint me as confused and incapable. Due to documented elder coercion, attempted institutional abandonment, and breach of fiduciary duty, Daniel Parker was permanently removed as beneficiary of the Parker Family Trust. Not reduced, not suspended, removed. Entirely. The silence that followed had a weight to it. Then came the second document, the one neither of them knew existed. My late husband had built a contingent clause years ago, one that redirected every asset meant for any child proven to act in bad faith against a surviving spouse. Our lake house in Vermont, the primary residence, investment accounts, even George's antique collection Daniel had already spoken of inheriting, all of it passed instead into the Evelyn Parker Foundation, a charitable trust funding housing assistance and legal aid for abandoned seniors. Brooke let out a sharp breath and whispered Daniel's name like, maybe he could still fix it. But there was nothing left to fix. The judge asked whether I wished to pursue the financial recovery claim tied to the attempted sale preparations Daniel and Brooke had initiated on my home. I looked at my son, the same man who once held my hand crossing a school parking lot, and I said yes. Calmly. Clearly. The forensic accounting had already traced the realtor deposits, the unauthorized consultations, the movement of funds from Daniel's joint account. By the end of the hearing, they were ordered to repay every dollar tied to the scheme, plus penalties. The public filing became permanent record. His law firm, where reputation was currency, placed him on immediate leave pending ethics review. Brooke's social circle learned the story before sunset. The woman who had smiled over brunches while planning where to put me once I was out of the house found invitations drying up overnight. Their punishment was not dramatic. It was worse. It was visible. It stayed. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited because Daniel himself had made this spectacle hoping to prove me incompetent. One asked if I felt vindicated. I told them, at my age, vindication means sleeping in your own bed and knowing no one can move you out of it. Martin smiled at that.
So did I.
2 weeks later, I hosted a dinner in the same dining room where Daniel first suggested a nursing home. Only this time the table was full of women from the foundation board, old friends, neighbors who had watched me endure quietly. There was laughter in that room again. Real laughter. My home did not feel under siege anymore. It felt mine. Daniel wrote twice, asking forgiveness. I sent no reply. Forgiveness and access are not the same thing. He learned that too late. On the morning I signed the foundation's first housing grant, I stood by George's portrait and thought how close I had come to believing age meant surrender. It does not. Age teaches timing. And timing had been everything. My son put my name on a nursing home waitlist believing he had begun my ending. What he actually triggered was his own removal from the future he thought was guaranteed. He wanted control of my estate. I took control of the story. He thought inheritance was a birthright. I taught him it was a privilege. And when people in town still ask if I really cut my only son out of the trust, I tell them the truth.
No.
He cut himself out the moment he tried to warehouse his mother. I only signed the paperwork. The last thing Daniel ever said to me in person was, "Mom, you chose strangers over family." I looked him in the eye and answered, "No, Daniel.
It chose dignity over greed."
Then I closed the door. And this time, it was my hand on the lock. "Mom, you've been on a nursing home waitlist for 3 weeks already," my son said over pot roast as if he were mentioning the weather, and I remember setting down my fork because my hand had suddenly gone cold. Daniel did not raise his voice.
He didn't have to.
Betrayal often arrives politely. Brooke reached across the table and touched his wrist, wearing that careful expression she used when she wanted to look compassionate in front of others. "It's only in case your health changes," she said. "We're just planning ahead." Planning ahead. Such harmless words. Such dangerous words. The dining room looked the same as it always had. The walnut sideboard George refinished himself, the brass chandelier casting warm light over the china I brought out only for Sundays, but something in the room had shifted. It felt as if the walls themselves were listening. I was 72 years old. I still drove myself to the grocery store, still trimmed my own roses, still climbed the attic stairs every spring to bring down the summer linens. Yet somehow my son had decided I was one medical event away from being stored somewhere behind cheerful wallpaper and bingo nights. I never agreed to a waitlist, I said. My voice surprised me. It was steady. Daniel avoided my eyes. He cut into his roast, too focused on the plate. There was paperwork, he muttered. Just preliminary. Brooke gave a small laugh. It's one of those nice communities, Evelyn. They have a walking trail around a pond. A pond, as if naming ducks and flower beds made abandonment sound civilized. I looked at my son then, really looked at him, and for a second I saw not the boy who once begged me to stay up until he fell asleep during thunderstorms, but a tired middle-aged man who had begun speaking about me in terms of logistics. It was not cruelty in his face that frightened me. It was efficiency. I smiled. I actually smiled. Brooke seemed relieved, as though she had expected tears. Daniel exhaled. They mistook silence for surrender. That was their first mistake. The next morning, before the dew had dried on the hydrangeas, I found an envelope tucked under the front door. White, official, stamped with the crest of Cedar Ridge Senior Living. Welcome, it read. Thank you for joining our preferred resident waiting list. My knees weakened, though I would never have admitted it aloud. They had not been discussing a possibility over dinner. They had already acted. Worse. Someone had listed my home address, my medical provider, even Daniel as financial contact. I stood in the hallway, with the letter trembling in my hand while sunlight crept across the hardwood floor George and I laid plank by plank 40 years ago. Every memory in that house seemed suddenly under threat. I did not call Daniel. I did not confront Brooke. I poured coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and read the letter 3 times. Then I reached for the old leather address book and dialed a number I had not used since George's funeral. Martin Hale answered on the 3rd ring. Our family attorney. Martin, I said, watching a cardinal land outside the window. I think my son has mistaken patience for weakness. There was a pause. Then he said, very quietly, come see me this afternoon. And that was the moment everything began. Martin Hale's office smelled faintly of leather and old paper, exactly as it had 20 years earlier when George and I signed the first trust documents. Some places resist time. Others simply hide what time is doing. Martin looked older, thinner around the face, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. He read the Cedar Ridge letter, without interrupting me once. Then he placed it on his desk and folded his hands. Did you authorize any of this? He asked. No. Did you sign anything your son brought you recently? I thought back. A month earlier Daniel had stopped by with insurance forms, or so he claimed. I had signed one page while distracted by soup on the stove. The memory left a bitter taste. Martin gave a slow nod, as though a puzzle piece had fallen into place. I want to show you something, he said. From a locked cabinet, he removed a thick binder labeled Parker Family Trust. George's handwriting stared at me from a yellow sticky note on the cover. If something ever feels wrong, call Martin first. My throat tightened. Martin turned pages carefully. Your husband was a cautious man, he said. He anticipated pressure could come one day, even from family. Then, he pointed to a clause I had barely remembered existed. A protective provision tied to coercion or forced institutional placement. I stared at the language while my pulse seemed louder than the wall clock. You are not as vulnerable as they believe, Martin said. I let those words settle over me. Vulnerable. That was how Daniel and Brooke had begun seeing me. A condition to manage. A problem to solve. Martin leaned back. But before we do anything, I need you to understand what may be happening at home. He slid another paper across the desk. A property inquiry request. My address typed neatly at the top. Submitted online 2 weeks earlier. Requesting valuation for sale preparation. My hands went still. They have been exploring the house, he said gently. I heard almost nothing after that for several seconds. just the old radiator clicking, the sound of a city bus passing outside. George had planted every maple tree on that property. Daniel learned to ride a bicycle in that driveway, and now strangers had perhaps already walked through it in their minds as square footage. I should have cried. Instead, I felt something colder rise in me. Precision. What do you recommend? I asked. Martin smiled in a way I had not seen since George was alive. I recommend you do exactly what they think you cannot do. Stay calm. By the time I drove home, late sunlight stretched across the road in long gold bars. I pulled into the driveway and sat with the engine off, watching Brooke's SUV parked beside Daniel's truck. Through the kitchen window, I could see them moving inside, silhouettes passing through the life I built. When I entered, Brooke was arranging flowers on the island as if she belonged in a magazine spread. Daniel looked up too quickly. "Everything all right, Mom?" he asked. I set my purse down and kissed his cheek. "Perfectly all right," I said. "I have been thinking perhaps you are right. Maybe I should tour that community." Brooke brightened instantly. Daniel relaxed. I almost pitied how easy they were to deceive. That evening after they left, I opened the hallway closet and found George's old lockbox behind winter blankets. Inside were deeds, stock certificates, letters, and a note in his unmistakable script. "Trust character, not charm." I read that line 3 times before bed. And for the first time since the letter arrived, I slept.
The
tour at Cedar Ridge took place on a Thursday morning under a bright September sky so blue it almost offended me. Brooke insisted on coming, though she framed it as support. Daniel met us there during his lunch break, wearing the same navy blazer he wore to court appearances, as if even this required performance. The place was immaculate. White rocking chairs on the porch, hydrangeas lining the walk. A smiling woman in pearls showing us a sunroom where residents played cards beneath framed watercolor paintings. It was all very tasteful, very careful, and deeply unsettling. Brooke kept saying things like, "See, Evelyn, it is practically a resort." Daniel asked about memory care as casually as someone asking about cable packages. I listened. I nodded. I even asked whether the one-bedroom suites had southern light. But inside, I was counting how often Daniel referred to my house as the property. Counting how Brooke asked whether residents could bring antique furniture, as though inventorying what she hoped would be left behind. Then, while the director stepped away to answer a call, Brooke leaned close to Daniel near a brochure rack, not knowing I stood within earshot around the corner. "If she takes the spring opening, we can list by May," she whispered. Daniel answered, too softly at first, then clearer. "After renovations, we clear at least 300,000 over asking." My pulse did not quicken. It slowed. That was the strange part. Once betrayal becomes measurable, it loses mystery. It becomes arithmetic. I picked up a brochure and returned before they noticed. On the drive home, Brooke chatted about the pond and walking paths. I watched fence posts pass by and thought of George teaching Daniel to fish at Lake Champlain, how patient he had been with tangled lines. Love leaves people blind longer than it should. That evening I called Martin. "They spoke of selling by May," I said. Silence. Then his dry reply. "Good. Let them keep talking." The next week became a performance. I played the grateful mother considering transition. Daniel brought over folders comparing costs. Brooke suggested downsizing my china before moving becomes overwhelming. She said it kindly enough that someone overhearing might have mistaken concern for tenderness. But cruelty in families rarely arrives shouting. It rearranges your belongings while smiling. Martin and I met twice more. Quiet meetings. Quiet signatures. A trust amendment drafted, but not yet executed. "Not until we test him," Martin said. That test arrived sooner than expected. One rainy afternoon, Daniel came by alone. He stood in the kitchen watching me peel apples. "Mom," he began, voice heavy with practiced reluctance, "there is something else. Cedar Ridge requires a financial commitment deposit. Temporary. 25,000. I kept peeling. The knife moved in one long ribbon. "And you need me to pay it?" I asked. "It is for your own security." Security. Such an abused word. I set the apple down and looked at him. His father's eyes. Brooke's ambition. What if I had medical bills tomorrow?
I asked.
Daniel hesitated, then shrugged in a way I will never forget. That is what Medicare is for. There it was. The test. Failed in a single sentence. After he left, I opened the kitchen drawer where George kept postage stamps and found his old fountain pen. I used it that evening in Martin's office to sign the amendment removing Daniel as primary heir. My hand did not tremble. Martin witnessed it, then closed the file. There, he said. Now let them believe they are still winning. As I drove home in the dark, porch lights glowing across the neighborhood, I realized something had shifted. I was no longer reacting to betrayal. I was preparing judgment. After Daniel asked for the deposit money, something in him seemed to relax, as if crossing that line had made the rest easier. The requests grew quieter but bolder. Brooke arrived one Saturday with moving catalogs and paint swatches she claimed were for freshening the house someday. Someday. She pinned samples against my kitchen wall while drinking tea from my wedding china. Soft gray. Cream linen. She spoke as if discussing my home after I was gone was an act of hospitality. I let her talk. Silence had become my sharpest instrument. That evening, after she left, I stood in George's study where dust gathered on the books he once reread each winter. His old desk lamp cast a pool of amber light over yellow legal pads and the brass compass he kept from his Navy years. I opened the bottom drawer and found letters tied in blue ribbon. Notes he wrote me when Daniel was a baby, when money was tight, when we nearly lost the house in the recession and somehow held on. In one he had written, "We do not build things so others may seize them. We build so family learn stewardship." I sat there for a long time holding that word. Stewardship. It was never about money. It was about character. And Daniel had mistaken inheritance for entitlement. 2 days later, Martin called. "I think it is time for phase 2, he said. His voice always carried a dry amusement when strategy was involved. We met at a small diner outside town where no one knew us. Vinyl booths. Burnt coffee. The kind of place George loved. Martin slid a folded paper toward me. A notice for a family consultation dinner, drafted to appear as though I wanted to discuss my transition plans. "Invite them all," he said. "Let them believe the announcement is theirs to make." I understood immediately. A trap works best when the target walks in smiling. In the weeks before that dinner, Daniel became almost attentive. He fixed a porch step I had not asked him to fix. Brooke brought casseroles. They were rehearsing virtue for an inheritance they believed was already theirs. One afternoon, I overheard Brooke on the patio speaking to a friend on speakerphone. "By summer we could use the equity for Naples," she said, laughing. Naples. Florida's sunshine purchased with my displacement. I closed the window without a sound. That night, I added another amendment through Martin, redirecting a portion of trust income to the foundation upon my death. Each signature felt less like punishment and more like restoration. Then came Sunday dinner. I set the table with the good silver.
Licandre.
Roasted chicken with rosemary, the way George liked. Daniel arrived carrying a bottle of wine too expensive for ordinary evenings. Brooke wore pearl earrings and the smile of a woman expecting congratulations. Halfway through dessert, Daniel cleared his throat and glanced at Brooke. There it was. The performance beginning. "Mom," he said warmly, "Brooke and I have been talking and we think spring would be the perfect time for your move." He said it in front of my sister June and my neighbor Eleanor, whom I had invited without explanation. Witnesses. Brooke added, "And once the house is sold, everything will be simpler for everyone." Simpler. I folded my napkin and set it beside my plate. "How fortunate," I said, "because I have an announcement too." Daniel smiled, thinking he knew the script. He did not notice the knock at the front door until Martin Hale stepped into the foyer carrying a leather briefcase. Brooke's smile faltered first. Daniel's came a heartbeat later. In that tiny silence before anyone spoke, I felt a calm so complete it almost resembled joy. They had spent months arranging my exit. They had no idea they had just arrived at theirs. Martin did not hurry. That was the first thing that unsettled Daniel. A guilty person expects drama and prepares arguments against it. Calm confuses them. He removed his coat, nodded to June and Eleanor, and set his briefcase beside my china cabinet as though he had merely stopped by for coffee. "I apologize for interrupting dinner," he said, though the faint lift at the corner of his mouth suggested he enjoyed the timing. Daniel stood halfway from his chair. "Martin, what is this?" My son tried for authority, but I heard strain beneath it. Brooke reached for her water glass and missed the stem the first time. I folded my hands in my lap.
"Please sit," I said.
"This concerns family planning." The words tasted almost sweet. Martin opened a folder and withdrew several documents, placing them carefully beside the dessert plates. "At Evelyn's request," he began, "we have updated and executed amendments to the Parker Family Trust." Daniel blinked once, slow and hard. "Updated," he repeated. He looked at me as if waiting for reassurance. I offered none. Martin continued. "Primary beneficiary designations have changed effective immediately." Brooke laughed too quickly. "This is about charity donations or something?" she said, but no one answered. Martin slid a page toward Daniel.
"My
son read 2 lines, and the color left his face. "This cannot be right." His voice cracked on the last word. There is a moment when a person realizes the floor they have been standing on was borrowed. I watched that moment happen to my own child. "You removed me?" he asked. "Not mother."
Not why.
"Removed me." Even then, his first instinct was possession. "No," I said quietly. "You removed yourself when you arranged where to put me before asking whether I wished to leave my own home." June lowered her fork. Eleanor did not pretend not to listen. "Witnesses matter." Brooke leaned forward. "Daniel was only trying to protect you." "By listing my house for sale?" I asked. That landed harder. Daniel's head turned sharply toward Brooke. In that flicker of panic between them, years of polite deceit showed its seams. Martin produced the property inquiry records, the deposit requests, the unauthorized paperwork tied to Cedar Ridge. Not accusations. Documents. Paper is a ruthless storyteller. Daniel pushed back from the table. "You had us investigated?" "No," Martin said dryly. "You documented yourselves." For a long moment, only the grandfather clock in the hall made sound. Then Daniel shifted tactics. Anger gave way to appeal. "Mom, this is a misunderstanding. We were trying to help." I looked at him and saw a man negotiating consequences, not remorse. There is a difference mothers often learn too late. Help does not begin by naming yourself my financial contact without consent, I said. Brooke stood abruptly. "This is humiliating." Eleanor, who had been widowed 10 years, spoke before I could.
"No, dir."
Humiliation was planning to warehouse his mother. I nearly smiled. Martin then read the final clause aloud. Because of attempted coercive institutional placement, Daniel's share passed irrevocably into the Evelyn Parker Foundation. Irrevocably. Such a beautiful word. Daniel stared as if language itself had betrayed him. "You would give strangers my inheritance?" he said.
"No, Ian Schwartz."
"I would give dignity a future." Then Martin closed the folder. I thought it was over. It was not. He cleared his throat and added, "There remains one further matter involving reimbursement. Exposure tied to sale preparations and fiduciary misconduct." Brooke sat down very slowly. Daniel whispered, "What does that mean?" Martin met his eyes. "It means this evening was the kind version." And for the first time since George died, I felt not abandoned, not endangered, but entirely in command of my own table. After Martin left that night, no one touched dessert. The pie sat untouched beneath the kitchen light while Daniel remained standing as though movement itself might confirm what had happened. Brooke was the first to recover. "We need to speak privately," she said, voice clipped and brittle. I looked toward the hallway.
"This is my home," I said.
"You may lower your voice or leave it." It was a small sentence, but power often returns in ordinary tones. Daniel followed them both onto the back patio, where they thought the sliding door muffled words. It did not. Houses remember. "You told me the property inquiry was informal," Daniel hissed. Brooke answered in a harsh whisper. "Do not make this my fault." For years they had moved as one mind. Under pressure, seams opened fast. June quietly gathered plates and carried them to the sink. Eleanor leaned close and murmured, "You did what many women only dream of doing." I did not feel triumphant yet, only clear. The next morning Daniel called before 8. 3 calls, then 4. I let the machine take them. By noon he appeared at my front door, shoulders drawn tight. No blazer now, no courtroom polish, only a frightened son wearing remorse like an emergency coat. "Mom, please." I let him in, but kept standing. He began where frightened people often begin, with excuses disguised as context. Stress, financial pressure, miscommunication. Brooke had pushed too hard. It all came out in fragments. I listened until he said, "I never thought you would actually cut me out." There it was again. Not I hurt you. Not I was wrong. Only surprise at consequence. "Sit down, Daniel," I said. He sat. I remained standing. "Do you know what hurt most?" I asked. "Not the waitlist. Not even the house. It was learning you had begun discussing my life, as though I were already absent." He looked down at his hands. For a moment I saw shame. Real shame, perhaps. But then he asked whether the amendment could be reversed. There are moments when hope dies so quietly only mothers hear it. "No," I said. "Irrevocable means what it says." He left before lunch looking smaller than when he arrived. I thought that would end it. It began something else. 2 days later Martin called. Daniel had retained counsel. "He intends to challenge competency and undue influence," Martin said. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because betrayal does repeat itself when desperate. "Then we finish what they started," I said. Discovery moved quickly. Their attorney requested medical records. Martin responded with physician evaluations proving full capacity. Then came subpoenas for emails, realtor correspondence, banking trails. Facts have a way of aging well. One afternoon Martin brought copies showing Brooke had emailed a designer floor plan labeled "after relocation." After relocation. Even their euphemisms condemned them. Meanwhile, whispers began moving through Daniel's firm. Ethics questions. Internal review. His confidence thinned. Brooke stopped appearing at church. People notice absences almost as much as scandal. Through all of it I kept my routines. Watered roses. Paid bills. Met with the new foundation board. That steadiness unsettled Daniel more than anger would have. During mediation, his lawyer proposed a compromise restoring part of his inheritance in exchange for dropping financial claims. Martin slid the offer toward me. I pushed it back untouched. "No settlements," I said. "Only judgment." Martin gave the faintest nod. George would have liked that answer. The hearing date was set for April. As I left the courthouse after pretrial motions, spring wind lifting blossoms across the steps, I realized the matter had grown larger than mother and son. It had become a question of whether age could be used as leverage against dignity. I had no intention of losing that question. And Daniel, though he did not know it yet, was about to discover the difference between challenging a document and challenging a woman who has already stopped being afraid. April arrived damp and gray, the kind of spring that makes courthouse marble feel colder than stone should. On the morning of the hearing, I wore the navy suit George always said made me look impossible to intimidate. It still fit. Martin met me on the courthouse steps carrying 2 binders thick enough to silence argument before it began. "Today they stopped telling a story," he said. "Today documents speak." Inside, Daniel avoided my eyes. Brooke sat beside him in cream wool, composed from a distance, brittle up close. She had perfected the face of injured innocence. But innocence does not arrive with subpoenaed emails. When proceedings began, Daniel's attorney made the expected claims. Confusion, elder vulnerability, undue influence by an opportunistic lawyer. I almost admired the ambition. Then Martin stood. He moved without flourish, each question laid down like brick. He entered the Cedar Ridge waitlist authorization, the forged financial contact forms, the property valuation request, Brooke's email discussing equity after relocation. Each exhibit carried its own quiet violence. No raised voices were needed. At one point, Daniel's attorney objected to the admission of an internal memo from Daniel's law firm discussing reputational concerns tied to the dispute. The judge overruled him. I watched Daniel's jaw tighten. Reputation had entered evidence. That mattered to him more than money. Then came the moment none of them expected. Martin called me to testify. My hands were steady on the witness rail. He asked whether I feared aging. No, I said. I feared being managed by people who confused convenience with care. A murmur moved through the gallery. Martin asked what changed my trust decisions. I looked at Daniel, not the judge. The day my son discussed my home as an asset before discussing my wishes as his mother. Daniel lowered his eyes. For a second, I almost saw the boy he had been. Then Brooke's attorney made a mistake born of arrogance. On cross-examination, he implied perhaps I misunderstood private conversations, that age can color perception. Martin rose before I could answer and requested permission to introduce audio. Brooke's face changed first. During discovery, a voicemail she had left by accident for a contractor had surfaced. Her voice, unmistakable, saying once the old woman moves, we can open the kitchen wall. The recording played in open court. No drama, just her own words hanging there. Even the judge removed his glasses and looked directly at Daniel. Sometimes exposure does not explode. It settles, like dust after a collapse. By afternoon, the ruling came. Daniel's competency challenge dismissed with prejudice. Financial misconduct claims sustained for trial damages unless settled immediately. His firm, already wavering, placed him on administrative suspension by week's end. Brooke left the courtroom before reporters gathered outside. Daniel did not. He approached me near the elevator, stripped at last of performance. "Mom," he said, voice low, "please do not let this ruin my career." Not our relationship. His career. Even then, I almost answered with anger, but anger is expensive and I had stopped overspending. "You mistook my silence for permission," I said. "That has cost you." Then I stepped into the elevator and the doors closed between us with a softness far crueler than slamming. Weeks later, mediation on damages began. Numbers moved. Penalties rose. Their side pushed settlement because public trial threatened more disclosure. Martin asked whether I wished to press full exposure or accept structured judgment. I looked out his office window at rain sliding down the glass and remembered the Cedar Ridge letter trembling in my hand months earlier. Fear had begun this story. It would not finish it. "Press forward," I said. Martin smiled. "Then part 2 begins." And I understood he was right. The trust battle had ended. The reckoning had not. Settlement conferences have a peculiar stillness to them, as if everyone in the room knows truth has already arrived and only the price remains under debate. Martin and I sat across from Daniel's attorneys in a paneled conference room overlooking the courthouse parking lot. Rain tapped the windows in soft, indifferent rhythms. Brooke was not there. Her counsel claimed illness, though Martin later told me absence is often strategy when presence becomes liability. Daniel looked older than he had months before. His suspension from the firm had become public. Colleagues who once sought his opinion now avoided lunch invitations. Reputation does not vanish loudly. It erodes in polite silence. Their attorneys proposed repayment of the unauthorized deposits and withdrawal of all property claims if I agreed to waive punitive damages. Martin did not even glance at me before saying, "Insufficient." It was almost elegant. Then he introduced something Daniel had not known we possessed. During financial tracing, an escrow communication revealed Brooke had sought bridge financing using projected equity from my house as leverage. Not merely discussing a future sale, positioning debt against it. Daniel turned toward his attorney so sharply his chair scraped. "You said that was not discoverable." His lawyer did not answer. I realized then something simple and devastating. My son had not merely followed greed. He had trusted greed to remain organized. It rarely does. Mediation broke after 4 hours. As we gathered papers, Daniel asked whether he could speak with me alone. Martin stepped out into the hallway. We sat in the emptied room, where coffee had gone cold. For a while Daniel said nothing. Then, quietly, "I thought Brooke and I were building a life." I looked at him and saw not innocence, but belated recognition. "At whose expense?" I asked. He covered his face with one hand. It was the first unscripted gesture I had seen from him in months. He told me Brooke had pushed the Naples plan, the renovation dreams, the assumption my trust would cushion everything. He said it as confession, perhaps expecting confession to earn rescue. But adulthood has a brutal lesson. Explanation does not erase outcome. "Do you hate me?" he asked. Mothers are asked impossible questions when children have run out of leverage. "No," I said. "But I no longer confuse loving you with protecting you from yourself." He cried then, quietly enough that only I could hear. I let him. Some grief belongs to those who caused it. A week later, Brooke filed for separation. That news moved through town faster than the court filings had. Her social certainty fractured. Friends who had admired her taste suddenly remembered old discomforts. The country club committee declined her event proposal. Small exclusions. Social law has its own court. Daniel called after the separation became public and asked if he could visit. I said Sunday. He arrived without the expensive watch he always wore, carrying a bakery box from the corner shop I used to take him to as a boy. We sat on the porch while evenings settled over the maples. He spoke of selling his condo to cover legal exposure, of maybe leaving law altogether. "What happens now?" he asked. I thought of the foundation paperwork waiting in Martin's office, of women on housing waitlists not chosen by sons, but by hardship. "Now," I said, "you live with what you built." The damages trial was set for June unless settlement closed first. On the Friday before jury selection, their side caved. Full restitution. Civil penalties. Written admission of unauthorized elder coercion filed under seal but enforceable. Martin called it complete victory. I did not. Victory sounds too much like conquest. This felt more like correction. Yet one piece remained unfinished. The foundation board wanted a public launch dinner in July and asked whether I would speak. I agreed. Martin suggested inviting Daniel. "Why?" I asked. He smiled. "Because the final lesson should be witnessed." I did not understand then what he meant. I would soon. Because the night of that dinner, before a ballroom full of donors and judges and old family friends, Daniel would stand up unexpectedly and say something that would change the ending of this story even I had not foreseen. The ballroom at the Harrington Hotel glowed in amber light, crystal chandeliers scattering reflections across linen and silver as if the room itself wished to look gentler than the stories gathered inside it. I stood behind the podium with my note cards untouched. I had written remarks about elder dignity, about housing grants, about the first women our foundation would support. But when I looked out and saw judges, former neighbors, women from church, even colleagues from Daniel's suspended firm, the speech I prepared felt too small. Truth often arrives without script. I spoke instead about homes, about what it means to age inside walls that know your history, about how betrayal can wear the face of concern. The room was still enough to hear glass settle against saucers. When I finished, applause rose slowly, then fully. Martin, seated near the front, gave the faint nod he reserved for legal victories and stubborn women. Then something happened no one expected. Daniel stood. At first I thought he meant only to clap longer than others. But he walked toward the stage. A murmur moved through the room. He looked thinner than months before, stripped somehow of professional polish and, in that absence, strangely more himself. He asked for the microphone. I should have refused. Instead, I stepped aside. "My mother told me once inheritance is a privilege," he began, voice unsteady. "I learned too late she meant character, not money." Silence sharpened. No one moved. He turned, not to me first, but to the room. He admitted he had helped place me on a wait list without consent. Admitted he had viewed my home through the lens of equity. Admitted greed dressed itself as practicality and he had mistaken ambition for adulthood. There was no theatrical confession in it. Only humiliation stripped of excuses. Then he faced me. "I spent months trying to recover assets," he said. "Tonight, I ask only to recover honesty." I do not know whether the room breathed in that moment. I only know my heart hurt in a place anger had once occupied. Then came the part Martin must have foreseen. Daniel removed a folded document from his jacket and handed it to me before everyone. a notarized renunciation of any future challenge to the trust, plus a voluntary pledge assigning a percentage of his remaining personal assets to the foundation as restitution beyond court order. Even Martin looked surprised. Reporters at the back scribbled furiously. The son whose name I had removed from my trust had publicly funded the cause born from his betrayal. There are endings no strategist can draft. After dinner, Daniel approached while guests gathered around the donor tables. "I do not expect forgiveness," he said. "Only that one day you might believe I changed." I looked past him at women signing pledge cards, at the foundation banner carrying George's name beneath mine. Change is not declared. It is lived. But something in his face no longer resembled negotiation. "We begin with truth," I said. "Nothing more tonight." He nodded, almost relieved by so little. The next morning newspapers ran a smaller story than Scandal would have made, but a deeper one. Suspended attorney publicly backs elder rights charity after family trust dispute. The irony pleased Martin immensely. Donations tripled within 2 weeks. The foundation purchased its first duplex for displaced senior women before autumn. Daniel, barred from returning to his old firm, took contract work helping low-income probate clients through a legal aid clinic Martin quietly recommended. Some punishments become apprenticeships if suffering teaches enough. Brooke attempted one final move in October, contesting financial penalties through separate counsel. The judge dismissed it in under 20 minutes and sanctioned fees against her petition as frivolous. Legal, financial, social. The reckoning had reached every ledger. One crisp November afternoon, Daniel stood beside me at the duplex ribbon cutting, handing keys to a widow forced from her home by relatives. As cameras flashed, he leaned close and whispered, "I nearly did to you what brought her here." "Nearly," I answered, because that word mattered. On the drive home, I passed Cedar Ridge and slowed by the sign where months earlier fear had first taken shape. I did not stop. Some roads exist only so you can know you no longer belong on them. And that night, as I turned the key in my own front door, I understood the ending was no longer about defeating betrayal. It was about surviving it without becoming hard. The final chapter, I realized, would not be written in court at all, but at my own dining table, where one last conversation with my son still waited. The Sunday after the ribbon cutting, I set the dining table for 2. No witnesses this time.
No eternis. No yayis.
Just blue willow china, pot roast slow cooking the way Daniel loved as a boy, and November light falling pale through the curtains. Some reckonings belong in public. Others demand a quieter room. Daniel arrived carrying nothing but a paper bag of fresh dinner rolls from the bakery. No performance remained in him. He looked around the room as though seeing it for the first time, perhaps noticing what greed had once reduced to square footage. The old oak floors. George's fishing photograph above the mantel. The tiny burn mark on the sideboard from a Christmas candle in 1987. History survives where entitlement sees only assets. We ate slowly. Spoke first of ordinary things. Weather. The foundation's second property. His legal aid work. There was tenderness in that restraint, as though both of us understood heavier words were waiting and neither wished to force them too early. After coffee, I brought out a long envelope and placed it beside his cup. Daniel looked wary. "What is this?" he asked. "Read it." Inside was a revised estate summary prepared by Martin. Not restoring him as heir. Never that. But naming him successor trustee of the foundation only after my death, contingent on years of service and board approval. He stared in disbelief. "After everything, you would trust me with this?" I shook my head. Not trust. Opportunity. There is a difference. Money taught you the wrong lesson. Responsibility may teach another. His eyes filled before he looked away. For a long time neither of us spoke. Then he asked the question I sensed had been growing in him for months. "Did you ever consider sending me away completely?" I smiled faintly. "I already did. Legally." Even he laughed at that. But then I told him the deeper truth. I removed you from the trust because you had to feel consequence. I left a path back because George believed correction without redemption becomes revenge. And I would not let betrayal turn me into something smaller. He bowed his head. "I do not deserve that mercy." Deserving has very little to do with family, I said. Outside, wind moved through the bare maple branches with that dry November whisper I have always loved. Daniel rose and walked to the window where, as a child, he used to wait for his father's truck at dusk. I thought putting you somewhere safe made me practical, he said quietly. I did not understand. I was trying to control. What frightened me? That was the first time he named fear instead of greed. And I knew then change had roots. Weeks later, the state bar closed its ethics inquiry with a public reprimand but allowed him to continue under supervised practice through legal aid. A scar, not a death sentence. Brooke left town before Christmas. Her appeals exhausted, debts mounting, social circles gone. The law had taken its share. So had reputation. There would be no dramatic ruin because life rarely grants such theater. Her punishment was narrower and colder. Irrelevance. On Christmas Eve, Daniel joined me to hang George's old brass ornaments. At one point, he held a tarnished angel and said, "You know, I used to think being written out of your trust was the worst thing that happened to me." I waited. Now I think it saved me. That line stayed with me, because perhaps it had. In January, Martin visited for lunch and asked whether I regretted anything. I told him only one thing. I regret how easily older women are expected to surrender authority the moment someone calls it care. He raised his coffee cup. Then keep proving otherwise. The foundation grew. The duplex became 3 homes. Women wrote letters saying our grants kept them from institutions they never chose. Every letter felt like another lock on my front door. One evening in early spring, Daniel stood on the porch preparing to leave and hesitated. "Mom," he said, "when you took my name out of the trust, I thought you were ending something." I touched the doorframe George had installed with his own hands.
"No," I said.
I was ending a lie. And in that moment, with dusk settling over the yard and my son no longer speaking to me as obstacle or benefactor, but simply as mother, I knew the final reckoning was complete. What remained was legacy. By late spring, the maple trees along my street had leafed out thick and green, and the house no longer felt like a place I had defended. It felt like a place restored. There is a difference. Defense carries memory of siege. Restoration carries peace. Daniel had settled into a quieter rhythm by then, working long hours through legal aid, driving older cars, living in a modest apartment. With second-hand furniture, he joked had more character than his old designer pieces. Humility had entered his life through necessity first, then perhaps conviction. I had begun to trust not promises but patterns. Patterns tell the truth, words often decorate. One Saturday, he arrived carrying folders from the foundation, proposals for a 4th property outside Hartford. We spread papers across George's old desk, the same desk where years earlier I found the letters that steadied me. As Daniel spoke about maintenance reserves and resident support programs, I caught myself studying his hands. The same hands that once signed documents meant to move me out, now drafting protections to keep other women in their homes. Life has a stern sense of irony. "I have been thinking," he said after a long pause, "about the day in court when you said I removed myself." He looked up. "You were right.
There was no self-pity in it now.
Only recognition. I keep asking how I became someone capable of that." I closed the folder in front of me. "Not all corruption begins with malice," I said. "Sometimes it begins with small permissions. One rationalization, then another." He nodded slowly, as though hearing a diagnosis. A week later, the foundation board voted unanimously to name our newest housing initiative the George and Evelyn Parker Homekeeping Project. At the dedication ceremony, an older woman named Lorraine took my hand and whispered, "My son wanted me in assisted living, so he could refinance my house. Because of your grant, I stayed." I stood there holding her hand and understood the story had grown beyond injury into witness. That evening, Daniel and I walked the property after guests left, dusk settling over the porch lights. "Do you ever still think about Cedar Ridge?" he asked. "Sometimes," I said. "Mostly as a door I never walked through." He smiled faintly. Then his expression changed.
"Brooke wrote me," he said.
The name had not entered conversation for months. It hung there oddly empty. She was living in Arizona, struggling, asking whether I might help reduce what remained of court penalties. Old reflexes stirred in him. Rescue.
Guilt.
Family habit. What will you do?
I asked.
He stared across the lawn. Nothing. Consequences taught me what excuses never could. There was the final evidence I had not known I was waiting for. Not repentance spoken to me, but principle applied elsewhere. Some lessons only become real when repeated without audience. In June, Martin retired. At his farewell luncheon, he lifted a glass and said, "Most people think trust law is about assets. It is about human nature under pressure." Then he looked at Daniel. Some survived that test better on the second attempt. We laughed, but I felt George in the room somehow, present in all we had salvaged. That autumn, I revised one last letter to accompany my estate documents. Not legal language this time, but plain words for Daniel to read after I am gone. I wrote that inheritance is never the house, never the account, never the silver wrapped in flannel upstairs. Inheritance is the moral architecture we leave standing. Months later, on my 73rd birthday, Daniel hosted dinner at my house, though he insisted on cooking. June brought pie. Eleanor brought roses. At dessert, Daniel stood and tapped his glass. I thought perhaps he meant a simple toast. Instead, he reached into his pocket and unfolded a paper yellowed at the edges. George's old note Martin had once shown me. Trust character, not charm. Daniel read it aloud, voice breaking. My father wrote this long before I understood it.
Then he looked at me.
My mother made sure I did. There are moments so quietly full they need no applause. I felt one then. And when the candles burned low and guests left and Daniel lingered by the doorway preparing to go, he turned back and said, almost shyly, "You know, Mom, being written out was never really the punishment."
No? I asked.
He shook his head. Losing your respect was. I watched him drive away under the streetlights and knew the story could have ended there. But one final truth remained, one I had learned too late to keep only for myself. It belonged in the ending. The older I grew, the less I believed justice arrived as thunder. More often it arrived as paperwork signed at the right hour, a door kept in your own name, a life forced into daylight where it could not survive. Yet even after everything Daniel and I had rebuilt, one last shadow from the old betrayal remained unfinished. In early winter, the State Attorney General's Elder Fraud Task Force contacted Martin's successor regarding several real estate consultants tied to coercive senior relocation schemes. Names surfaced during a broader investigation. One of them was the broker Brooke had used when she first explored leveraging my house. Subpoenas followed. Archived emails were reopened. And because our case had left a trail too detailed to ignore, Brooke was drawn back into public record one final time. I was not looking for more reckoning, but reckoning came. The hearing was brief, administrative by legal standards, devastating by social ones. Brooke was cited in a civil enforcement action tied to attempted deceptive asset positioning involving vulnerable seniors, fined heavily and barred from participating in licensed property brokerage partnerships. It was not prison. It was something quieter and, for someone who had built life on status, perhaps harsher. Professional erasure. Her name appeared in trade publications beneath compliance sanctions. The same circles that once admired her ambition now used her as cautionary example. Financial consequence. Public consequence. Final consequence. When Daniel read the notice, he sat at my kitchen table for a long time without speaking. I thought consequences had already ended, he said. Some truths take longer to finish unfolding, I answered. He nodded, but what struck me was not satisfaction. It was relief. The old manipulation had no more hidden chambers. Everything was exposed. Everything priced. A month later, the foundation hosted its annual winter gala, larger now than I ever imagined when it began in pain. Judges attended.
Clergy.
Donors. Women who once faced eviction stood there as homeowners through our assistance program. At the close of the evening, the board surprised me with something Daniel had organized in secret. A plaque unveiled near the entrance of the first residence. Evelyn Parker House. Under it, one line engraved in brass. Dignity is not transferable. I touched the lettering with my fingertips and felt George beside me more strongly than in years. Then Daniel stepped to the microphone. No trembling this time.
No confession. Just certainty.
Years ago, he said, I mistook control for care and inheritance for entitlement. My mother answered not with surrender, but with boundaries that saved more than one family. He paused and looked directly at me. Everything I lost, I deserved. Everything she allowed me to rebuild, I did not earn. That is grace. The room rose in applause before I could move. But the true payoff came after. A reporter asked whether it was true I had once removed my son from my trust for trying to place me in a facility. I took the microphone back and said, yes. And I would do it again. Because love without consequence is how betrayal breeds. You could feel the room take that in. Some women wept openly. Others smiled with the fierce expression of people hearing their own unspoken history named aloud. That night, Daniel drove me home. Snow began falling in slow white ribbons under the headlights. At my front walk, he stopped me before I reached the door and handed me a new deed folder. What is this? I asked. Open it. Inside was a transfer instrument for a small cottage on Lake Champlain purchased through his own earnings and donated irrevocably to the foundation as transitional housing. In memory of George Parker. I looked at him for a long moment. Once he had tried to move me out of a home. Now he was placing one into the hands of women he would never meet. There are reversals so complete they feel almost biblical. You understand now, I said. He smiled.
Ido.
In spring, when I turned 73, I revised nothing in my trust. Not a dollar. Not a clause. Because control once reclaimed did not need constant defense. It simply existed. Daniel remained outside the inheritance except for the conditional stewardship path I had created, and that remained by my choice, not sentiment. Brooke vanished from our lives entirely, carrying penalties she had authored herself. The law had spoken. Reputation had spoken. Life had spoken. And I remained in my home, at my table, under my name. Sometimes people still ask whether removing my son from the trust was harsh. I tell them no. Harsh would have been allowing betrayal to pass as family concern. What I did was correction. One summer afternoon, a woman at the foundation asked how I found courage when my own child tried to decide where I belonged. I told her the truth. The day he put me on a list, he believed age made me easier to move. What he forgot was that old women have spent lifetimes surviving what younger people call impossible. She laughed through tears. So did I. And that is how the story ends. My son tried to place me in a waiting line for surrender. I placed him outside my fortune until he learned the value of honor. The greedy were exposed. The law took its due. Reputation collected the rest. My home was never sold. My name was never displaced. My trust became my weapon, then my legacy. And in the end, the son who once tried to manage my ending helped build my lasting work. He put my future on a waitlist. I wrote him out of privilege. Then I taught him how to earn his way back to dignity. And when I lock my front door each night, it is my hand on the key, my name on the deed, and my story exactly where it belongs.